The silence stretched between Anthony Howard and Ethan Diaz like a taut wire, heavy with the weight of words that had just escaped into the humid summer air. The ceiling fan above them clicked rhythmically, its lazy rotation doing little to dispel the charged atmosphere that had settled over the small living room. Anthony's eyes were wide, almost panicked, as if he could somehow pull back the confession that had tumbled from his lips just moments before. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the couch cushion, knuckles white with tension. Ethan sat frozen on the opposite end of the couch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird as he processed what his best friend had just admitted. "I've been thinking about you," Anthony had said, his voice barely above a whisper, each word carefully measured as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment between them. "Not just as a friend. I think about what it would be like to," and then he had stopped abruptly, his face flushing crimson as he realized how much he had revealed. The unfinished sentence hung between them like an unspoken promise, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to examine. The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, transforming their comfortable Friday night routine of pizza and movies into something charged with possibility and terror. The half-empty pizza box sat forgotten on the coffee table, grease stains marking the cardboard like evidence of their interrupted normalcy. Ethan could see the regret already creeping into Anthony's expression, the way his shoulders tensed as if preparing to flee, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. This moment, this revelation that had shifted the very foundation of their friendship, had been building for months without either of them fully recognizing it. Like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface, their relationship had been shifting imperceptibly, creating fault lines that had finally erupted into this moment of truth. But to understand how they had arrived at this precipice, how two straight friends had found themselves staring across an emotional chasm that neither had expected, the story needed to rewind to where it all began. The apartment around them bore witness to their friendship's evolution. Photos from their college days lined the mantelpiece, showing two young men with easy smiles and casual arms thrown over each other's shoulders. Movie ticket stubs from their weekly cinema visits were scattered across the coffee table, and Ethan's photography equipment occupied one corner of the room, a testament to the creative passion that had first brought them together. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, Anthony Howard had been living what most people would consider a perfectly ordinary life, though ordinary had begun to feel increasingly like a costume that no longer fit properly. At 26, he worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, spending his days crafting visual narratives for clients who rarely appreciated the subtle artistry he brought to their mundane products. He shared a 2-bedroom apartment with his college roommate Richard Wright, a good-natured accountant whose idea of excitement was finding a new spreadsheet formula. The apartment was a study in comfortable masculinity, all dark leather furniture and sports memorabilia, with Anthony's artistic touches relegated to his bedroom and the small corner of the living room where he kept his design books and sketches. It was the kind of space that looked like it belonged in a catalog titled Young Professional Bachelor Pad, carefully curated to project an image of heterosexual success. Anthony had recently ended a 2-year relationship with his girlfriend, Marie Clark, a sweet kindergarten teacher with blonde hair and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. The breakup had been amicable enough, both of them sitting in her car outside his apartment building on a rainy Tuesday evening, acknowledging that something fundamental was missing from their connection, though neither could quite articulate what that something was. "We're like two puzzle pieces that almost fit," Marie had said, her voice soft with resignation as rain drummed against the windshield. "Close enough that we can force it, but not close enough that it feels natural." Anthony had nodded, feeling relief and guilt in equal measure. He had cared for Marie deeply, had genuinely tried to love her the way she deserved to be loved, but there had always been something holding him back, some invisible barrier that prevented him from fully surrendering to the relationship. He had attributed it to fear of commitment, to the general anxiety that seemed to plague his generation when it came to serious relationships. It was during this period of romantic limbo, when he was questioning everything he thought he knew about love and compatibility, that Anthony had grown closer to Ethan Diaz. They had been acquaintances in college, Friends of friends who had shared a photography class during their junior year, bonding over their shared appreciation for visual storytelling and their mutual disdain for the pretentious art students who dominated most of their classes. Ethan had recently moved to the same city for a job at the local newspaper, working as a photojournalist covering everything from city council meetings to high school football games. He lived in a small studio apartment across town, a space that reflected his artistic sensibilities, with exposed brick walls covered in his own photography, and plants that somehow thrived despite the limited natural light. Ethan was everything Anthony felt he wasn't, confident and outgoing, with an easy smile and the kind of natural charisma that drew people into his orbit like moths to a flame. He had dark hair that always looked perfectly tousled, as if he had just run his fingers through it, and warm brown eyes that seemed to hold genuine interest in everyone he met. There was something magnetic about his presence, a quality that made conversations flow effortlessly and silences feel comfortable rather than awkward. Their friendship had developed naturally, built on shared interests in art and design, long conversations about everything from obscure foreign films to philosophical questions about the meaning of success in modern society. They would meet for coffee and end up talking for hours, their conversations meandering through topics with the kind of intellectual intimacy that Anthony had rarely experienced. Anthony found himself looking forward to their hangouts with an intensity that surprised him. When Ethan texted, Anthony would feel a small thrill of anticipation, his heart rate picking up as he read messages that were often nothing more than links to interesting articles or observations about his day. When they spent evenings together, time seemed to move differently, hours passing like minutes as they lost themselves in conversation and shared experiences. Anthony told himself this was simply what it felt like to have a close male friend. He had never really experienced that before, having grown up as an only child and gravitating toward female friendships throughout school and college. His father had been emotionally distant, more comfortable expressing affection through practical gestures than through words or physical closeness. And Anthony had learned early that male relationships were supposed to be based on shared activities rather than emotional intimacy. The intensity of his connection with Ethan was new territory, and he assumed the butterflies in his stomach were just the result of finally understanding what people meant when they talked about bromance. He had read articles about the importance of male friendship, about how men needed close platonic relationships to maintain emotional health, and he convinced himself that what he was feeling was simply the joy of finally experiencing that kind of connection. The first crack in Anthony's understanding of his own feelings came on a Tuesday evening in late spring, when the air was soft with the promise of summer and the city seemed to pulse with renewed energy. He and Ethan were sitting in Anthony's living room, Richard having gone out for the evening with his girlfriend, leaving them alone with takeout containers from their favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine that Ethan had brought over. The apartment felt different with just the two of them there, more intimate somehow, as if the absence of Richard's cheerful presence had created space for something deeper to emerge. They had settled onto the couch with their food, the television playing softly in the background, but neither was paying much attention to the mindless sitcom reruns that flickered across the screen. The conversation had meandered from work stress to childhood memories, the kind of deep, rambling discussion that only happened when two people felt completely comfortable with each other. The wine had loosened their tongues and lowered their inhibitions, allowing them to share stories and observations that they might have kept to themselves in other circumstances. Ethan had been telling him about his most recent breakup, a relationship with a woman named Catherine Reed that had ended the previous month. Catherine was a curator at a local art gallery, intelligent and sophisticated, with the kind of refined aesthetic sense that should have been perfect for someone in Ethan's field. As he spoke, Anthony found himself studying his friend's profile in the warm lamplight, noting the way Ethan's jaw tensed when he talked about the relationship's failure, the way his fingers absently traced patterns on the wineglass stem. She was great on paper, Ethan was saying, his voice carrying a note of frustration that Anthony had never heard before, a vulnerability that made Anthony want to reach out and offer comfort. Smart, funny, beautiful. We had all the same interests, all the same goals. She understood my work, appreciated my photography, even helped me get a few gallery showings. But something was missing, like I was going through the motions of being in love without actually feeling it. Anthony nodded, understanding flooding through him like a warm tide. The description resonated so deeply with his own experience that it was almost unsettling. "That's exactly how I felt with Marie," he said, his voice soft with recognition. "Like I was playing a role I thought I was supposed to play, hitting all the right marks, but never quite feeling like it was really me up there on stage." Ethan turned to look at him then, their eyes meeting across the small space between them on the couch. There was something in Ethan's gaze that made Anthony's breath catch, a searching quality that seemed to be looking for something specific in Anthony's expression. The eye contact lasted longer than it should have, charged with a meaning that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "Do you ever wonder if we're missing something fundamental about ourselves?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the television's laugh track. "Like maybe we're looking for connection in all the wrong places?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to examine. Anthony felt his heart rate accelerate, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the wine. He found himself leaning slightly closer to Ethan, drawn by an invisible force he couldn't name, like iron filings pulled toward a magnet. "I think about that all the time," Anthony admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Especially lately. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, following a script that was written for me before I was old enough to know I had a choice in the matter." They sat in silence for a long moment, the space between them seeming to crackle with unspoken possibility. The television continued its mindless chatter, but the sound seemed to fade into background noise as Anthony became hyper-aware of every detail of the moment. He could hear Ethan's breathing, slightly shallower than normal, could see the way the lamplight cast shadows across his features, making his eyes appear even darker and more intense. The air between them felt thick with potential energy, like the moment before a storm when the atmosphere becomes charged with electricity. Anthony found himself cataloging details he had never noticed before. The way Ethan's shirt stretched across his shoulders, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the way his lips parted slightly when he was thinking deeply about something. Then Ethan's phone buzzed, the sound cutting through the charged atmosphere like a knife. He glanced at it and sighed, the moment dissolving as quickly as it had formed, leaving Anthony feeling strangely bereft. "I should probably head home," he said, though he made no immediate move to leave, his body language suggesting he was as reluctant to break the spell as Anthony was. "Early meeting tomorrow with the editor." Anthony felt a stab of disappointment so sharp it surprised him with its intensity. "Of course," he said, forcing his voice to sound casual despite the way his heart was still racing. Thanks for the wine and for listening." As Ethan gathered his things and headed toward the door, Anthony found himself memorizing every detail of his departure. The way he moved with unconscious grace, the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor, the brief moment when their hands brushed as Anthony handed him his jacket. The contact sent a jolt of electricity up Anthony's arm, and he had to resist the urge to hold on longer than was appropriate. After the door closed behind him, Anthony stood in his empty living room, trying to make sense of the emotions churning through him like a tempest. The apartment felt hollow without Ethan's presence, as if something vital had been removed from the atmosphere. He found himself replaying their conversation, analyzing every word, every glance, every moment of connection. That night he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to him. He told himself he was overthinking things, that the intensity he felt was simply the result of finally having a deep friendship with another man. But deep down, in a place he wasn't quite ready to examine, he knew something fundamental had shifted. The foundation of his understanding about himself had developed a crack, and he could feel it slowly widening with each passing hour. Over the following weeks, Anthony found himself paying closer attention to his interactions with Ethan, cataloging moments that seemed charged with something more than friendship. He became a detective of his own emotions, analyzing evidence and looking for patterns that might explain the growing intensity of his feelings. There was the way Ethan's hand would linger on his shoulder when he laughed at one of Anthony's jokes, the contact lasting just a beat longer than casual friendship would require. The way their knees would bump when they sat next to each other at restaurants, and neither would move away, both seeming to draw comfort from the simple contact. The way Ethan would look at him sometimes, with an expression Anthony couldn't quite decipher, but that made his stomach flutter with nervous energy. Anthony began to notice things about Ethan that he had never paid attention to before. Details that seemed to imprint themselves on his consciousness with startling clarity. The way he smelled, a subtle combination of cologne and something uniquely him, clean and masculine and somehow comforting. The way his voice changed when he was tired, becoming softer and more intimate, with a slight rasp that made Anthony want to lean closer to catch every word. The way he moved through space with an unconscious grace that Anthony found himself watching with increasing fascination. These observations troubled Anthony in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He had never found himself thinking about another man in this way, had never experienced the kind of magnetic pull toward male friendship that seemed to be developing between him and Ethan. He wondered if this was normal, if all close male friendships involved this level of emotional and physical awareness, this constant desire to be in the other person's presence. The uncertainty was compounded by the fact that Ethan seemed to be experiencing something similar. Their text conversations had become more frequent and more personal, with Ethan sharing details about his day that seemed designed to invite Anthony deeper into his inner world. He would send photos from his assignments, not just the professional shots, but candid moments that captured his perspective on the world around him. Ethan would ask questions about Anthony's thoughts and feelings with the kind of genuine curiosity that Anthony had rarely experienced, even in romantic relationships. He seemed genuinely interested in Anthony's opinions on everything from politics to art to the small frustrations of daily life, and he would remember details from previous conversations with an attention that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. One evening, as they walked through the city after dinner at their favorite restaurant, the conversation turned to relationships again. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and the warm air carried the sounds of evening traffic and distant music from open restaurant doors. The city felt alive around them, full of possibility and energy that seemed to mirror the growing tension between them. "I've been thinking about what we talked about a few weeks ago," Ethan said, his hands shoved deep in his pockets as they strolled past shop windows and sidewalk cafes. "About looking for connection in the wrong places." Anthony felt his pulse quicken, his body responding to the shift in Ethan's tone before his mind had fully processed the words. "What about it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I keep wondering if the problem isn't that I haven't found the right person," Ethan continued, his voice thoughtful and slightly hesitant. "Maybe the problem is that I've been looking for the right person in the wrong category entirely. Like I've been shopping in the wrong section of the store, you know?" The words sent a jolt of electricity through Anthony's system, his heart rate spiking as he processed the implications. He tried to keep his voice steady as he responded, though he could hear the slight tremor in his own words. "What do you mean?" Ethan stopped walking and turned to face him, and Anthony was struck by the vulnerability in his expression. They were standing under a streetlight that had just flickered on, casting a warm glow across both their faces and creating an intimate bubble of light in the gathering darkness. "I mean," he said slowly, as if testing each word before releasing it, "what if the reason none of my relationships with women have felt right is because I'm supposed to be with someone else entirely? Someone I've been thinking of as just a friend?" Anthony's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Ethan could hear it, the sounds seeming to echo in his ears like thunder. The implication of Ethan's words was clear, but Anthony found himself unable to fully process them, his mind reeling with the possibility that his feelings might be reciprocated. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the city noise around them. Ethan's eyes searched his face, and Anthony could see vulnerability there, mixed with hope and fear in equal measure. "I don't know," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of uncertainty and possibility. "I just know that I've never felt as connected to anyone as I feel to you. And I keep wondering what that means, what it says about who I really am." The confession hung between them like a bridge, and Anthony felt himself standing at the edge of it, looking across at Ethan and trying to find the courage to take the first step. The conversation that night marked a turning point in their relationship, though neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge it fully. They walked the rest of the way to Anthony's apartment in a charged silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what had been said and what it might mean for their friendship. The familiar streets seemed different somehow, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis, revealing new possibilities that had always been there but had remained hidden until now. When they reached Anthony's building, they stood awkwardly by the entrance, neither wanting to end the evening, but both unsure how to proceed. The air between them felt thick with possibility and uncertainty, as if they were standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump or step back from the precipice. "Do you want to come up?" Anthony asked, his voice careful and neutral, though his heart was racing with the implications of the invitation. "We could watch something or just talk more. Richard's probably asleep by now." Ethan hesitated for a moment, and Anthony could see him weighing the decision, considering the implications of spending more time alone together after such a charged conversation. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice soft but determined. "I'd like that. I don't think I'm ready for this evening to end yet." They climbed the stairs to Anthony's apartment in silence, the weight of their earlier conversation following them like a shadow. Each footstep seemed to echo with significance, and Anthony found himself hyper-aware of Ethan's presence beside him, the sound of his breathing, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed against Anthony's as they navigated the narrow stairwell. Richard was indeed asleep, leaving them alone in the space that had become so familiar to both of them. Anthony busied himself making coffee while Ethan settled onto the couch, both of them moving with the kind of careful choreography that suggested they were hyper-aware of each other's presence. The domestic routine felt different now, charged with new meaning and possibility. When Anthony joined him on the couch, coffee mugs in hand, he noticed that Ethan had chosen to sit closer to the middle than usual, leaving less space between them. The proximity sent a thrill through Anthony's system, even as it made him more nervous. He could feel the heat radiating from Ethan's body, could catch hints of his scent every time he moved. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said, accepting his coffee and cradling the warm mug in his hands, as if drawing comfort from its heat. "Of course," Anthony replied, settling back against the couch cushions and trying to appear more relaxed than he felt. "When you were with Marie," Ethan began, his voice quiet and almost hesitant, "did you ever find yourself thinking about other people? Not necessarily anyone specific, but just wondering if there was someone else there who could make you feel the way you thought you were supposed to feel?" Anthony considered the question carefully, turning it over in his mind as he searched for an honest answer. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but never anyone specific, like you said. It was more like I was thinking about the idea of someone else, someone who could make me feel complete in a way that Marie couldn't, someone who understood me on a level that felt effortless." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his coffee mug as if it held the answers to questions he was afraid to ask directly. "I used to think about what it would be like to be with someone who really understood me," he said, his voice soft and contemplative. "Someone who got my sense of humor, who I could talk to for hours without getting bored or feeling like I had to perform some version of myself. Someone who made me feel like myself instead of like I was constantly trying to be the person I thought they wanted me to be." As he spoke, his eyes met Anthony's, and the intensity of his gaze made Anthony's breath catch. There was something searching in Ethan's expression, as if he was looking for confirmation or recognition in Anthony's face. "It sounds like you're describing a very specific person," Anthony said, his voice barely above a whisper, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for Ethan's response. "Maybe I am," Ethan replied, his own voice soft and uncertain, but with an undertone of something that might have been hope. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken possibility hanging between them like a physical presence. Anthony could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could see the rapid rise and fall of Ethan's chest that suggested he was experiencing the same overwhelming mix of excitement and terror. The apartment around them seemed to fade into background, the familiar furniture and decorations becoming irrelevant as all of Anthony's attention focused on the man sitting beside him, on the way the lamplight played across his features, on the way his fingers moved nervously against his coffee mug. "Ethan," Anthony said quietly, his voice carrying all the weight of the questions he was afraid to ask directly. "Yeah?" Ethan's response was barely audible, his eyes never leaving Anthony's face. "What are we doing here?" The question came out more vulnerable than Anthony had intended, carrying all his uncertainty and hope and fear. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, setting his coffee mug aside and turning to face Anthony more fully. I just know that I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about what it might be like if we stopped pretending this is just friendship. The confession hit Anthony like a physical blow, confirming what he had been feeling but hadn't dared to acknowledge. The relief of hearing his own secret thoughts reflected back to him was overwhelming, mixed with a terror so profound it made his hands shake. "I've been thinking about you too," Anthony whispered, the words feeling both foreign and completely natural on his tongue, as if he was finally speaking a truth he had been carrying inside him for months without realizing it. "I've been trying to convince myself it's normal, that this is just what close friendship feels like. But I know it's more than that. I know it's something I've never experienced before." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, hope and fear warring in his expression as he processed Anthony's admission. "What does that mean for us?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of all the implications and possibilities that stretched out before them. Anthony didn't have an answer, not a complete one anyway. The territory they were entering was completely uncharted for both of them. Two men who had lived their entire lives assuming they were straight, suddenly confronted with feelings that challenged everything they thought they knew about themselves. It was like discovering a new room in a house they had lived in their entire lives, a space that had always been there, but had remained hidden behind a door they had never thought to open. "I don't know," Anthony said honestly, his voice carrying all his uncertainty and vulnerability. "I've never felt this way about another man before. I don't even know what this way is exactly. All I know is that when I'm with you, everything feels right in a way it never has with anyone else. It's like I've been trying to fit into clothes that were the wrong size my entire life. And suddenly I found something that fits perfectly." Ethan reached out then, his fingers finding Anthony's hand where it rested on the couch between them. The contact sent electricity shooting up Anthony's arm, and he had to resist the urge to pull away from the intensity of it. Instead, he found himself turning his hand palm up, allowing their fingers to intertwine in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "I'm scared," Ethan admitted, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across Anthony's knuckles, the simple touch sending waves of sensation through Anthony's entire body. "I'm terrified of ruining our friendship, but I'm also terrified of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if we were brave enough to find out." Anthony looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how right it felt, how natural. The sight of Ethan's fingers intertwined with his own should have felt strange or wrong, but instead it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was trying to solve. Their hands fit together perfectly. Ethan's slightly larger and more calloused from his photography work, but somehow complementing Anthony's in a way that felt inevitable. "Maybe we could just see what happens," Anthony said quietly, his voice steady despite the way his heart was racing. "Take it slow, figure it out as we go. We don't have to have all the answers right now." Ethan's grip on his hand tightened slightly, and Anthony could see relief flooding his expression. "Are you sure?" he asked. Once we cross this line, we can't uncross it. Everything changes from here." Anthony met his eyes, seeing his own mixture of fear and hope reflected back at him in Ethan's warm brown gaze. "I've never been less sure of anything in my life," he said with a shaky laugh that carried all his nervousness and excitement. But I've also never wanted anything more. I'd rather take the risk and find out what this could be than spend the rest of my life wondering." That night they talked until the early hours of the morning, exploring the implications of their mutual confession and trying to navigate the complex emotions it had unleashed. They talked about their past relationships, analyzing them through this new lens of understanding, recognizing patterns they had never seen before. They talked about their fears, their hopes, their complete lack of experience with same-sex attraction. The conversation meandered through territory that was both deeply personal and entirely new to both of them. They discussed what it might mean for their identities, how they would navigate the practical implications of a relationship that neither had expected. They talked about coming out, about facing questions from friends and family, about the uncertainty of exploring attraction to the same sex for the first time in their mid-20s. As dawn began to filter through the windows, casting soft gray light across the living room, they found themselves lying on opposite ends of the couch facing each other, their legs tangled together in the middle. The casual intimacy of the position felt revolutionary to Anthony, a physical manifestation of the emotional boundary they had crossed. "I should probably go home," Ethan said, though he made no move to untangle himself from their comfortable position. His voice was soft with exhaustion, but there was contentment there too, a peace that Anthony recognized because he felt it himself. "Probably," Anthony agreed, equally reluctant to end the moment, to break the spell of intimacy and possibility that surrounded them. But neither of them moved. They lay there in the growing light, studying each other's faces with a new kind of attention, as if seeing each other clearly for the first time. Anthony found himself memorizing details he had never noticed before. The way Ethan's eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks, the small freckle near his left ear, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was relaxed. "This feels different," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying wonder and a hint of amazement. "Good different or scary different?" Anthony asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Both," Ethan replied with a soft smile. "Definitely both." The weeks that followed were a careful dance of exploration and discovery, each day bringing new revelations about themselves and each other. Anthony and Ethan continued to see each other regularly, but their interactions now carried a charge of possibility that transformed even the most mundane activities into something significant. A casual touch while reaching for the same menu item became a moment of electric connection that left both of them slightly breathless. Eye contact that lasted a beat too long became a silent conversation about desire and uncertainty. They were both hyper-aware of the shift in their dynamic, but neither was quite sure how to proceed. The territory they were exploring had no roadmap, no guidebook for two straight men discovering attraction to each other for the first time. They had crossed an emotional line, acknowledged their mutual attraction, but the physical territory remained largely unexplored, a landscape of possibility that both excited and terrified them. They would find excuses to touch each other, hands brushing while passing objects, shoulders bumping while walking side by side, but always with a careful casualness that maintained plausible deniability. It was as if they were speaking in a new language that they were both still learning, communicating through glances and gestures and moments of contact that carried more weight than words. Anthony found himself analyzing every interaction, cataloging moments of connection, and trying to decipher their meaning with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient text. When Ethan would laugh at one of his jokes and lean into him, was that just natural physical expression or something more intentional? When their knees would touch during dinner and neither would move away, was that a conscious choice or unconscious comfort? The uncertainty was both thrilling and exhausting. Anthony had never experienced this level of emotional and physical awareness with another person. Every sense seemed heightened when Ethan was around, as if his entire nervous system had been recalibrated to detect even the smallest changes in Ethan's mood or behavior. He found himself noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The way Ethan's voice changed when he was relaxed, becoming softer and more intimate. The way he moved his hands when he talked. Graceful gestures that seemed to paint pictures in the air. The way his eyes would crinkle slightly when he smiled, creating small lines that Anthony found inexplicably endearing. Their friends began to notice the change in their dynamic, though none seemed to understand what was really happening. Richard would make jokes about their bromance, teasing them about how much time they spent together, but his comments carried no real suspicion, just the good-natured ribbing that was typical of their friendship. Other friends would comment on how close they had become, how they seemed to have their own private language of inside jokes and shared references. One evening, about 3 weeks after their initial conversation, they were at Ethan's apartment watching a movie. It was a thriller that neither was particularly invested in, something they had chosen more for background noise than for actual entertainment, and they found themselves talking through most of it, their conversation meandering from the film's plot holes to more personal topics. Ethan was sitting at one end of his couch, Anthony at the other, but as the evening progressed, they had gradually migrated toward the center, the space between them shrinking with each shift in position. It was an unconscious movement, like planets being drawn together by gravity, neither fully aware of how they had ended up so close until Anthony realized he could feel the warmth radiating from Ethan's body. The apartment was dimly lit, just the glow from the television screen and a single lamp in the corner creating pools of warm light. Ethan's photography covered the walls, black and white images that captured moments of beauty and truth in everyday scenes. The space felt intimate, impersonal, a reflection of Ethan's artistic sensibility and his way of seeing the world. During a particularly tense scene in the movie, Ethan reached out and grabbed Anthony's arm, a reflexive gesture that would have been unremarkable in their previous friendship, but now felt charged with significance. Anthony looked down at Ethan's hand where it rested on his forearm, noting the way Ethan's fingers seemed to unconsciously caress his skin through the fabric of his shirt. The contact sent warmth spreading through Anthony's entire body, and he found himself hyper-aware of every point where Ethan's skin touched his. He could feel Ethan's pulse through his fingertips, could sense the slight tremor that suggested Ethan was as affected by the contact as Anthony was. "Sorry," Ethan said, starting to pull his hand away as he realized what he had done. "I didn't mean to grab you like that." "It's okay," Anthony said quickly, catching Ethan's hand before he could withdraw it completely. The movement was instinctive, driven by a desire to maintain the connection that felt too precious to lose. "I don't mind. Actually, I like it." Their eyes met in the flickering light from the television screen, and Anthony could see his own mixture of desire and uncertainty reflected in Ethan's gaze. The movie continued playing, explosions and dramatic music filling the soundtrack, but neither was paying attention anymore. All of Anthony's focus was on the point where Ethan's skin touched his, the gentle pressure of fingers that seemed to be memorizing the shape of his arm. "Anthony," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely audible over the movie's soundtrack, but carrying a weight that made Anthony's heart skip. "Yeah?" Anthony's response was equally soft, his entire being focused on the man beside him. "What are we doing?" The question was familiar, one they had asked before, but it carried different weight now. They were no longer just acknowledging their feelings. They were actively exploring them, testing the boundaries of their comfort zones and discovering new aspects of themselves in the process. "I think we're figuring it out," Anthony said, his voice steady despite the way his heart was racing, despite the way every nerve ending seemed to be firing at once. "Is that okay?" Ethan's thumb traced a small circle on Anthony's forearm, the simple gesture sending waves of sensation through Anthony's entire body like ripples on a still pond. The touch was gentle but deliberate, a conscious choice rather than an unconscious gesture, and the intentionality of it made Anthony's breath catch. "It's more than okay," Ethan said, his voice soft but certain. "It's just new. Everything about this is new." New was an understatement. For both of them, this was uncharted territory in every possible way. They were not only exploring attraction to another man, they were doing it with each other, with someone who had been a close friend, someone whose good opinion mattered deeply to both of them. The stakes felt impossibly high, the potential for both incredible joy and devastating loss balanced on a knife's edge. The movie ended without either of them noticing, the credits rolling as they sat in the dim light of Ethan's living room, still connected by the simple touch of hand to arm. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with possibility and question marks, heavy with the weight of decisions that needed to be made. Anthony could feel his pulse in his throat, could hear the sound of his own breathing in the quiet apartment. The city noise from outside seemed muted, as if the world had receded to give them space to navigate this moment without interruption. "I should probably head home," Anthony said eventually, though he made no move to leave, his body seemingly reluctant to break the connection they had established. "You could stay," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying a note of hope that made Anthony's heart flutter. "If you want, the couch is comfortable or there's the guest room. Whatever feels right." The invitation was casual on the surface, but Anthony could hear the deeper question underneath it. They had reached another threshold, another opportunity to deepen their connection or maintain the careful boundaries they had been navigating. The choice felt significant, weighted with implications about where their relationship was heading. Anthony considered the offer, weighing his desire to be close to Ethan against his uncertainty about moving too fast. He thought about going home to his empty apartment, lying awake analyzing every moment of the evening, wondering what might have happened if he had been brave enough to stay. The thought of leaving felt wrong somehow, like walking away from something important before it had a chance to fully develop. "I'd like to stay," Anthony said, and he could see relief flood Ethan's expression, followed by something that might have been joy. They went through the motions of preparing for sleep, Ethan finding extra pillows and blankets for the couch, Anthony borrowing a t-shirt and sweatpants that smelled like Ethan's laundry detergent in something uniquely him. The domestic intimacy of sharing space, of Ethan's clothes against his skin, felt both natural and revolutionary. The guest room was small but comfortable, decorated with more of Ethan's photography and a few personal items that spoke to his interests and personality. Anthony found himself studying the details, learning more about Ethan through the objects he chose to keep close: books of poetry, vintage cameras, a small plant that somehow thrived in the limited light. As Anthony settled onto the couch and Ethan headed toward his bedroom, they exchanged goodnights that carried more weight than such simple words should. There was tenderness in Ethan's voice, a warmth that made Anthony feel cherished and valued in a way he had never experienced before. "Sleep well, Anthony," Ethan said, his voice soft in the darkness. "You too," Anthony replied, wishing he could say more, wishing he had words adequate to express what this meant to him. Anthony lay in the darkness of Ethan's living room, surrounded by his scent and his belongings, and tried to process the events of the evening. He had never spent the night at another man's place in this context, had never felt this particular mixture of comfort and excitement about such a simple thing as sleeping under the same roof as someone he was attracted to. Every aspect of the experience felt significant, from the way Ethan's t-shirt fit against his skin to the sounds of Ethan moving around in the next room as he prepared for bed. Anthony found himself listening to those sounds with an attention that bordered on reverence, cataloging each footstep and door closing as evidence of Ethan's presence just one room away. Sleep was a long time coming. Anthony lay awake listening to the sounds of the apartment settling, hyper-aware of Ethan's presence just one room away. He found himself wondering if Ethan was having similar trouble sleeping, if he was lying in his bed thinking about Anthony on the couch, analyzing the evening's interactions, and wondering what would happen next. When Anthony finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with fragments of sensation and emotion, touches and glances and conversations that felt both familiar and completely new. He dreamed of hands intertwining, of eyes meeting across small distances, of the sound of Ethan's laughter and the warmth of his presence. He woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Ethan moving around in the kitchen, the domestic sounds creating a sense of comfort and belonging that Anthony had never experienced before. For a moment, he was disoriented, forgetting where he was, but then the events of the previous evening came flooding back, bringing with them a complex mixture of excitement and nervousness about facing Ethan in the morning light. Morning brought with it a new set of dynamics to navigate, the harsh light of day casting their developing relationship in a different perspective than the intimate evening hours had provided. Anthony found Ethan in the kitchen, already dressed for work, pouring coffee into 2 mugs with the easy efficiency of someone comfortable in his own space. The sight of him in his professional clothes, hair still slightly mussed from sleep, sent a jolt of attraction through Anthony that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Ethan looked up as Anthony entered the kitchen, and his face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. There was something different about his expression, a warmth and openness that hadn't been there before, as if some barrier had been lowered during the night. "Good morning," Ethan said, offering him one of the mugs with a smile that seemed slightly shy, as if he wasn't quite sure how to navigate this new territory either. "Sleep okay?" "Better than expected," Anthony replied, accepting the coffee and noting the way their fingers brushed during the transfer, the brief contact sending familiar electricity up his arm. "The couch is more comfortable than it looks." They stood in the kitchen, sipping their coffee and making small talk about their respective days ahead. But underneath the mundane conversation was an undercurrent of awareness that hadn't been there before their conversation the night before. Anthony found himself studying Ethan's profile as he talked, noting the way the morning light caught in his dark hair, creating highlights he had never noticed before. The way his lips moved around his words with an unconscious grace that Anthony found mesmerizing. The kitchen was small and efficient, designed for someone who appreciated good coffee and simple meals. Ethan's photography equipment occupied one corner, cameras and lenses arranged with the care of someone who treated his tools as extensions of himself. The morning light streaming through the window created interesting shadows and highlights, and Anthony found himself seeing the space through Ethan's eyes, understanding why he had chosen this particular angle for his breakfast routine. "I keep thinking about last night," Ethan said suddenly, his voice quiet and slightly uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether bringing up their conversation was appropriate in the bright light of morning. Anthony's heart skipped, his pulse quickening as he processed Ethan's words. "What about it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the way his entire body seemed to be vibrating with nervous energy. "Just how natural it felt," Ethan said, meeting his eyes across the small space of the kitchen. "Having you here, I mean. Waking up knowing you were in the next room. Like this is how things are supposed to be." The confession sent warmth spreading through Anthony's chest like sunrise, a feeling of rightness and belonging that he had never experienced before. He had been thinking the same thing, but hadn't been sure how to articulate it, hadn't been certain that Ethan was feeling the same sense of domestic intimacy that had overwhelmed him. "I know what you mean," Anthony said, his voice soft with recognition. "It didn't feel strange or awkward like I thought it might. It felt like the most natural thing in the world." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what this new level of intimacy meant for their relationship. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was charged with possibility, heavy with questions about where they were heading and how quickly they wanted to get there. As Anthony prepared to leave for his own apartment to change for work, they found themselves standing by the door, reluctant to end the moment. The morning routine felt significant, like a preview of something they both wanted but weren't quite ready to fully acknowledge. "Dinner tonight?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying a note of hope that made Anthony's stomach flutter with anticipation. There was something different about the invitation, more intentional than their usual casual hangouts. "I'd like that," Anthony said, already looking forward to the evening ahead, to the opportunity to continue exploring whatever was developing between them. "Your place or mine?" Ethan asked, then quickly added, "Mine, if that's okay. I could cook this time." The offer felt significant, another step toward deeper domestic intimacy. Anthony could picture Ethan in his kitchen, preparing food for both of them, the simple act carrying weight that went far beyond mere sustenance. "What time?" he asked. "7," Ethan suggested, his eyes searching Anthony's face as if looking for confirmation that this was what they both wanted. "Perfect," Anthony said, and then, acting on impulse that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, he leaned forward and pressed a quick, soft kiss to Ethan's cheek. The gesture surprised both of them. It was the first intentionally romantic physical contact they had shared, and the moment Anthony's lips touched Ethan's skin, he felt a jolt of electricity that was unlike anything he had experienced before. Ethan's skin was warm and slightly rough with morning stubble, and the scent of his soap and shampoo filled Anthony's senses. Ethan's breath caught audibly, and when Anthony pulled back, he could see wonder and desire warring in his expression. There was surprise there too, but it was the kind that spoke to pleasant shock rather than discomfort. "I'll see you tonight," Anthony said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion, with the intensity of what had just passed between them. Ethan nodded, his hand coming up to touch the spot where Anthony's lips had been, his fingers tracing the area as if trying to preserve the sensation. "Yeah," he said quietly, his voice full of anticipation and something that might have been joy. "Tonight." That day passed with excruciating slowness for Anthony, each hour dragging by like molasses as he found himself unable to concentrate on anything but the evening ahead. He found himself unable to focus on work, his mind constantly returning to the morning's kiss and the dinner they had planned. The simple gesture had opened something between them, a door that neither could close, and Anthony found himself both thrilled and terrified by what lay on the other side. He replayed the moment obsessively, analyzing every detail with the intensity of a forensic investigator. The soft warmth of Ethan's skin against his lips, the slight roughness of morning stubble, the sharp intake of breath that had suggested Ethan was as affected by the contact as Anthony was. It had been such a simple thing, barely more than a friendly peck, but it had felt revolutionary in its implications. His co-workers noticed his distraction, making jokes about him being lovesick, but Anthony found himself unable to explain what was really happening. How could he tell them that he was falling for his male best friend, that everything he thought he knew about himself was being rewritten with each passing day? By lunchtime, Anthony had given up any pretense of productivity. He spent his lunch break walking through the city, trying to process his emotions and prepare himself for the evening ahead. The familiar streets seemed different somehow, as if his changing understanding of himself had altered his perception of the world around him. He found himself thinking about identity, about the labels he had used to define himself for 26 years. He had never questioned his sexuality before, had simply assumed that his attraction to women was the full extent of his romantic capacity. The idea that he might be capable of loving a man had never occurred to him, but now it seemed not just possible, but inevitable. By the time 7 o'clock arrived, Anthony was a bundle of nervous energy. He had changed clothes 3 times, unable to decide what was appropriate for what felt like their first real date, even though neither had explicitly labeled it as such. He finally settled on dark jeans and a button-down shirt that Ethan had once complimented, then spent 10 minutes in front of the mirror trying to make his hair look casually perfect. The walk to Ethan's apartment felt both eternal and instantaneous, his anticipation making time move in strange ways. When he arrived, he could smell something delicious cooking from the hallway, rich aromas that made his mouth water and his stomach flutter with nervous excitement. Ethan answered the door wearing an apron over his clothes, his hair slightly disheveled from cooking, and Anthony felt his heart skip at the domestic sight. There was something incredibly attractive about seeing Ethan in his element, comfortable and confident in his own space, creating something beautiful for both of them to share. "Perfect timing," Ethan said, stepping aside to let him in, his smile bright and welcoming. "I'm just finishing up." The apartment smelled incredible, filled with the aromas of garlic and herbs and something rich and savory that made Anthony's mouth water. But more than the food, he was struck by the obvious effort Ethan had put into the evening. The apartment had been cleaned and organized, candles flickered on various surfaces, creating warm pools of light, and soft jazz played from Ethan's speakers. The table was set with actual dishes instead of their usual paper plates, complete with cloth napkins and what appeared to be Ethan's good silverware. Wine glasses caught the candlelight, and a bottle of red wine sat breathing on the counter. The entire scene spoke to careful planning and attention to detail that made Anthony's heart swell with affection. "This is amazing," Anthony said, looking around at the transformed space with wonder and appreciation. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble with the." "I wanted to," Ethan said, and there was something in his voice that made Anthony look at him more closely. His expression was soft but determined, vulnerable but hopeful. "This feels important," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of significance. "I wanted it to be special." The admission sent warmth flooding through Anthony's system, confirming what he had hoped but hadn't dared to assume. He had been thinking the same thing, but hadn't been sure if Ethan was approaching the evening with the same sense of significance. The fact that he had put so much thought and effort into creating a romantic atmosphere suggested that he was taking their developing relationship as seriously as Anthony was. "It is special," Anthony said softly, his voice carrying all the emotion he felt, but couldn't quite articulate. You're special." They ate dinner by candlelight, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did between them, but with an undercurrent of romantic tension that transformed even mundane topics into something charged with possibility. Anthony found himself watching Ethan's hands as he talked, the way his fingers moved when he gestured, graceful and expressive, the way his lips curved around certain words. The food was excellent, some kind of pasta dish, the sauce that spoke to hours of careful preparation, but Anthony could barely taste it. All of his attention was focused on Ethan, on the way the candlelight played across his features, creating shadows and highlights that made him look like a work of art, on the way his eyes seemed to hold a new kind of warmth when they met Anthony's across the small table. As they finished eating, the conversation turned to more personal topics, the wine and the intimate atmosphere, encouraging them to share things they might have kept to themselves in other circumstances. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about the future. The alcohol had loosened their tongues and lowered their inhibitions, allowing them to explore emotional territory that felt both dangerous and necessary. "I never thought I'd be here," Ethan said as they cleared the dishes together, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an ease that spoke to their growing intimacy, their bodies seeming to know instinctively how to navigate the shared space. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be having romantic feelings for my male friend, I would have laughed. Anthony nodded, understanding completely. The idea would have seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. A scenario so far outside his conception of himself that he wouldn't have been able to process it. I keep waiting for it to feel wrong or strange, he said, handing Ethan a plate to dry. But it doesn't. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. As they finished cleaning up, they found themselves standing close together by the sink, the domestic task complete, but neither wanting to move away. The proximity sent electricity shooting through Anthony's system, and he could see his own awareness reflected in Ethan's expression. The air between them felt charged, heavy with possibility and desire that neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Anthony, Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that made Anthony's heart race. The sound of his name on Ethan's lips sending shivers down his spine. Yeah? Anthony's response was barely audible, his entire being focused on the man standing so close to him. Can I ask you something? Ethan's voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if he was afraid of the answer but needed to ask the question anyway. Of course, Anthony said, though his heart was pounding with anticipation and nervousness about what Ethan might want to know. Ethan hesitated for a moment, as if gathering courage, his eyes searching Anthony's face for some sign of encouragement or permission. Have you ever kissed another man? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implication and possibility that made Anthony's breath catch. He shook his head, his mouth suddenly dry with nervousness and anticipation. No, he said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. Have you? No, Ethan admitted, his own voice soft and vulnerable. But I've been thinking about it a lot. Anthony's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Ethan could hear it, the sound seeming to echo in his ears like thunder. The admission was both thrilling and terrifying, confirming what Anthony had been hoping, but hadn't dared to assume. What have you been thinking? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stepped closer, close enough that Anthony could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could catch the scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. I've been thinking about what it would be like to kiss you, he said, his voice soft and uncertain but filled with longing. About whether it would feel as right as everything else between us does. The confession sent a jolt of desire through Anthony that was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a want so intense it was almost painful. He found himself leaning slightly closer to Ethan, drawn by an invisible force that seemed to be pulling them together like magnets. I've been thinking about that too, Anthony admitted, his voice hoarse with emotion and desire. Every day, every time I look at you. They stood there for a long moment, close enough to feel each other's breath, both of them balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything between them. Anthony could see the want in Ethan's eyes, mixed with the same uncertainty and fear that he was feeling. But underneath it all was a certainty that this was right, that this was what they both wanted. Can I? Ethan started to ask, but Anthony was already nodding before he could finish the question, his body responding before his mind had fully processed the request. Yes, Anthony whispered, the word carrying all his desire and hope and fear. Please. The first touch of Ethan's lips against his was soft, tentative, a question rather than a statement. Anthony felt his eyes flutter closed as he leaned into the contact, his hands coming up to rest on Ethan's chest, feeling the rapid beating of his heart beneath his palms. The kiss was gentle and careful, both of them testing the waters of this new territory they were exploring together, neither wanting to move too fast or assume too much. But as the initial uncertainty faded, replaced by the rightness of the connection, the kiss deepened. Anthony felt Ethan's hands slide up to cup his face, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones with a tenderness that made his heart ache. Their lips moved together with increasing confidence, the hesitation melting away as they discovered that this felt as natural and right as everything else between them. The sensation was unlike anything Anthony had ever experienced, different from kissing women in ways he couldn't have anticipated, but that felt completely right. There was something about the slightly rough texture of Ethan's skin, the strength in his hands, the solid warmth of his body that felt both foreign and completely familiar, as if he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment. Anthony found himself melting into the contact, all his nervous energy transforming into something warmer and more certain. He could taste the wine on Ethan's lips, could feel the slight tremor in his hands that suggested he was as affected by this as Anthony was. The world seemed to narrow to just this moment, this connection, this perfect rightness that he had never known he was missing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, they rested their foreheads together, eyes still closed as they processed what had just happened. The silence was profound, heavy with the weight of significance and change and possibility. "Wow," Ethan whispered, his voice full of wonder and something that might have been awe. "Yeah," Anthony agreed, his own voice shaky with emotion and overwhelmed by the intensity of what they had just shared. Wow, they stood there for a long moment, foreheads touching, hands still on each other, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Anthony felt as if something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself, as if a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was missing had finally clicked into place. Everything made sense now in a way it never had before. "That felt," Anthony started to say, then stopped, unable to find words adequate to describe the experience. The way it had felt like coming home to a place he had never been, but had always been searching for. "Right," Ethan finished for him, his voice soft but certain. It felt right. Anthony opened his eyes and found Ethan looking at him with an expression of such tenderness and wonder that it made his heart ache with the beauty of it. There was love there, he realized. Not just attraction or curiosity, but genuine, deep love that took his breath away. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice carrying all the emotion he felt but couldn't quite articulate. It did. They moved to the couch, sitting close together, hands intertwined, both of them trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened between them. The kiss had confirmed what they had both been feeling, but hadn't dared to fully acknowledge. This was more than friendship, more than curiosity, more than experimentation. This was the beginning of something real and significant and beautiful. "I'm scared," Anthony admitted quietly, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of Ethan's hand, the simple touch grounding him in the reality of this moment. "Me too," Ethan said, his voice soft with understanding. "But I'm also happier than I've been in a long time. Maybe happier than I've ever been." They talked late into the night again, this time with the new intimacy of their kiss adding another layer to their connection, deepening their understanding of each other and of what they were building together. They explored their feelings, their fears, their hopes for what this might mean for their future. They talked about the practical implications, the questions they would face from friends and family, the uncertainty of navigating a relationship that neither had experience with. But underneath all the practical concerns was a current of joy and rightness that neither could deny. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they both felt certain that this connection between them was worth exploring, worth fighting for, worth the risk of everything they might lose. As the evening wound down, they faced the question of sleeping arrangements again. The couch had worked the night before, but now, after their kiss, it felt like they were operating under different rules, navigating new territory that required careful consideration. "You could stay in the guest room," Ethan offered, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he wasn't sure what the appropriate boundaries were anymore, what was moving too fast and what was simply natural progression. Anthony considered the offer, weighing his desire to be close to Ethan against his uncertainty about moving too fast, about rushing something that felt too precious to risk damaging. "The guest room," he said finally, though every fiber of his being wanted to ask if he could stay closer. "I think that's probably wise, at least for tonight." Ethan nodded, understanding in his expression, and Anthony could see relief there that they were both committed to taking things at a pace that felt comfortable for both of them. They were both navigating uncharted territory, trying to balance their growing attraction with the need to build something solid and lasting. But as they said goodnight outside the guest room door, they shared another kiss, this one more confident than the first but no less tender. Anthony felt himself melting into Ethan's embrace, marveling at how natural it felt to be held by him, to feel the strength of his arms and the warmth of his body, to know that this was where he belonged. "Good night, Anthony," Ethan whispered against his lips, the words carrying more weight than a simple farewell. "Good night," Anthony replied, reluctant to let go, but knowing they both needed time to process everything that had happened, to let the reality of their new relationship settle into their understanding of themselves. That night, Anthony lay in Ethan's guest bed, surrounded by his scent and the knowledge that he was just one room away, and felt a contentment he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the person he was supposed to be with. The uncertainty about his identity, about what this meant for his future, seemed less important than the simple truth that he loved Ethan and was loved in return. The next few weeks passed in a blur of discovery and deepening intimacy, each day bringing new revelations about themselves and each other. Anthony and Ethan spent almost every evening together, exploring their new relationship with the careful attention of scientists conducting a delicate experiment, but also with the joy of two people who had found something beautiful and unexpected. They took things slowly, each new level of physical intimacy carefully negotiated and mutually agreed upon. They progressed from tentative kisses to longer, more passionate embraces, learning the language of each other's bodies with the reverence of scholars studying sacred text. They learned the geography of each other's bodies through careful exploration, hands mapping shoulders and backs, and arms with the reverence of cartographers discovering new continents. Every touch felt significant, every kiss a small revelation about themselves and each other. Anthony discovered that Ethan was ticklish just below his ribs, that he made small sounds of contentment when Anthony ran his fingers through his hair, that he tasted like coffee and possibility and home. Ethan learned that Anthony's breath hitched when he kissed the sensitive spot just below his ear, that he relaxed completely when Ethan traced patterns on his back, that he smiled in his sleep when he felt safe and loved. Anthony found himself falling deeper in love with each passing day. Love was a word they had started using freely now, no longer afraid of its implications or its power. He could feel it growing inside him like a warm light, illuminating aspects of himself he had never known existed. Everything about Ethan fascinated him, from the way he laughed at his own jokes to the way he concentrated when he was editing photos, his brow furrowed in intense focus. They began to talk about the future with more certainty, conversations about what this relationship meant and where it might be heading. Both of them were aware that they were crossing into territory that would require them to redefine themselves publicly, to come out to friends and family, to navigate a world that wasn't always accepting of relationships like theirs. But the challenges seemed manageable when they faced them together. Anthony had never felt so supported, so understood, so completely accepted for who he was. Ethan saw all of his quirks and insecurities and loved him, not despite them, but because of them. In return, Anthony offered Ethan the same unconditional acceptance, the same deep understanding that came from truly knowing another person. They came out to their closest friends gradually, starting with Richard, who surprised them both with his immediate acceptance and support. "I wondered when you two were going to figure it out," he said with a grin, as if their relationship had been obvious to everyone but them. Their other friends responded with similar warmth, some expressing surprise, but all offering love and support. The moment that had started this story, the confession that had hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, now seemed like a lifetime ago. They had crossed that bridge together, hand in hand, and found something beautiful on the other side. The fear and uncertainty that had once dominated their interactions had been replaced by confidence and joy, by the security that came from knowing they were loved completely and unconditionally. 3 months after that first tentative admission of attraction, Anthony and Ethan were no longer questioning their feelings or their future together. They had moved past uncertainty into something solid and real, a love that had grown from friendship into something deeper and more meaningful than either had ever experienced. They had started looking for an apartment together, making plans that extended years into the future, building a life that reflected their shared values and dreams. As they sat on their couch now, in the apartment they had decided to share, Anthony reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had required courage from both of them, the willingness to risk everything they had built as friends for the possibility of something greater. But the risk had been worth it, had led them to a love that was deeper and more satisfying than anything either had imagined possible. "I love you," Anthony said, the words coming easily now, as natural as breathing, as necessary as air. "I love you too," Ethan replied, pulling him closer and pressing a kiss to the top of his head, the gesture so familiar now that it felt like coming home. They had found their way to each other through uncertainty and fear, guided by nothing more than the certainty that what they felt was real and worth pursuing. And now, settled into the comfortable rhythm of their shared life, Anthony knew that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, the ones that required you to redefine everything you thought you knew about yourself. In the end, the silence that had once stretched between them like a taut wire had been replaced by a comfortable quiet, the kind that existed between two people who knew they were exactly where they belonged. The confession that had once seemed so terrifying had become the foundation of something beautiful, a love that neither had expected, but both had been brave enough to embrace. Their story had become one of discovery and courage, of two people who had been willing to question everything they thought they knew about themselves in order to find something real and lasting. It was a story about the power of friendship to transform into something deeper, about the courage it takes to be vulnerable with another person, about the beauty that can emerge when two people are willing to take a leap of faith together. As they settled into sleep that night, wrapped in each other's arms in the bed they now shared, Anthony felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He had found not just love, but himself in the arms of the man who had started as his friend and had become his everything. The journey had been unexpected, sometimes frightening, but ultimately it had led him exactly where he was meant to be.